Well, Connor, are you ready to get started?
Yes, thank you. Do you want to start by calling the roll?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So
Thank you.
I'll start by doing a quick roll call, and I'll go down the list, and when I call everyone's names, if you can unmute and say here so we can test that your audio is working, that would be great. So I'll start with the members of the Committee on Regulation. Connor Rosso.
Here.
Paige Bullard. James Ming Chen. H. Clayton Cook. Christopher C. DeMuth.
Here.
Jonathan Doles.
Here.
Susan Dudley. Michael Fitzpatrick. H. Russell Frisbee. Nathan Kazmarek. Alice Kottmeyer. Elliot P. Laws. Daniel R. Levinson. Erica Lightson. Michael A. Livermore.
Yep, here.
Randolph M. Lyon. Charles A. Maresca.
Here.
Christina E. McDonald.
Yes, I'm here.
Mary E. McLeod. David W. Ogden. Clinton Jones. Richard Revez. Carrie F. Ricci.
Here.
Jonathan Rose. J.R. Schwartz. Sydney A. Shapiro. Catherine M. Sharkey. Ganesh Sitaraman.
Here.
Peter L. Strauss.
Here.
David C. Vladeck. Jonathan B. Weiner. Richard E. Wiley. Chin Yu.
Here.
And Marion L. Zobler. Okay, so those are all the members of the committee. I will now call the individuals who are ACUS members but not on this committee, who still have speaking privileges but won't be able to vote. Jim Tozy. Stephanie Tatham.
Present.
Peter J. Constantine. William Funk.
Here.
And Lena Chang.
Here.
Is there anyone who is a member of ACUS or an alternate for a member of ACUS who I have not called or who came in after I called their name, who is here?
Jim Chen here.
Alice Kottmeyer here.
Great. Anyone else?
Diana Hobbs.
Paige Bullard here.
Great. If that's everyone, I will turn it over to Matt Weiner for opening remarks.
I'm going to yield my time to Connor with my thanks to everyone for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Matt. And I want to echo thanks to the ACUS team for their work in turning around the next draft. Also, special thanks to Peter Strauss for some extensive and I think helpful written comments. Thank you, Peter, for your time and attention. With that, I think we can dive right into the recommendation, but I'll just quickly go over the ground rules for today. Same as last time, only ACUS members, whether or not on the committee, and their designated alternates have full speaking privileges. But please do keep your microphone on mute. And if you want to be recognized to speak, please either use the chat feature, or I like this, somebody started using this reactions tool in Zoom, which we did not have before on the GoToMeeting, where you raise your hand. So I like that. If you use that, please unraise it at the end so I can keep track of the queue. If you're speaking, please use the webcam. With respect to attendees who are not ACUS members and alternates, participation requires unanimous consent of the committee. Time permitting, I will consider calling on non-ACUS members at appropriate points. I'll presume committee consent absent somebody raising an objection. And as we noted last time, folks should identify themselves and their institutional affiliation if one. And if you'd like, if you're an alternate, I'm sorry, if you're a non-ACUS person, non-alternate, please use the chat feature or the Zoom hand raising feature. Again, please, no sidebar discussions for anybody or substantive comments in the chat feature, or we'll get sidetracked and distracted. In terms of voting, we may be voting on a few alternatives today. Only the regulation committee members, and that includes the government members, their designated alternates, public members, senior fellows, liaisons, special counsels, only the members of the committee have a vote. And Leanne will help me count votes. Please don't vote, though, if you're not a member of the committee. We do have our rosters here, and we will do our best. And I think with that, we will dive into the recommendations. I think like last time, we will do the recommendations first. Leanne has hopefully marked up the recommendations, and I think we got a few late comments that are going to be on Leanne's screen that might not be on what we were distributed, just because they came very late, which is fine. So I would direct your attention to Leanne's screen. And if you want to go down to recommendation 1, Leanne, I think we can start there. And it looks like we don't have anything submitted there. What you're seeing is, and Leanne circulated a red line or a black line, if you will, from the draft from the first meeting, but what you're seeing is a clean version that reflects our best take on the committee's deliberations last time. So with that, I will open the floor to comments on recommendation 1, which on the screen is lines 38 through 56, excuse me. And if you're like my screen, you may have to hit the chat feature again. Let me see here. The participant screen again when it goes up. So I'm opening chat and participants. So if anyone's typing, I hope I can see it now. Okay, hearing no comments or seeing no comments on recommendation 1. Yes.
Sorry. No, never mind.
Any others? Okay. Recommendation 2. Let's see here. We have a comment from the FCC. And Chin, did you want to speak to this?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the comment is sort of self-evident. We were especially wondering why advisory groups were deleted from this list. We found them to be quite useful in the pre-NPRM process.
Leanne, do you recall, Charlie, we'll go back to number 1. Sorry to miss you. Leanne, do you recall, I don't recall any specific committee discussion on that point, but do you?
So this is something we changed between drafts. I believe on citizen juries, I think our concern was that there may be no agencies that actually use them, or very few, and we weren't sure that that was a good thing to recommend. And in terms of the advisory committees, my understanding, and perhaps the committee understands differently, in which case we can certainly change it back, but my understanding is that advisory committees are a kind of focus group, and so we didn't want to be redundant.
I tend to think that the explicit inclusion of advisory committees would be helpful. I mean, focus groups, in my view, are much more informal, and there are a number of benefits, at least that we've seen, from having something go through a formal advisory committee process.
Other reactions? Okay, hearing no objection, will include advisory committees.
I would suggest including citizen juries too, only because the recommendation is only to consider using these methods. And I think that while you're right, it hasn't been used frequently, I do think it is an innovative technique that would merit at least consideration.
Any
How do
objection?
citizen juries differ from focus groups?
That's a good question. Focus groups tend to, for me, seem to be broader. Citizen juries have a sort of specific charge and are asked to come out not with a verdict as real juries are, but with recommendation. Focus groups are more means for getting feedback on a proposal.
Stuart, is citizen jury something that has like a broadly understood meaning? I'm not that familiar with it, but is it something that's relatively well understood in this context?
It is in the academic literature. I don't know how much so in within government, how well it's understood, but it's certainly an idea that that has been raised in academic articles. I see Sid also has his hand up there.
Sid?
Sorry, maybe I got in early. I have a question about another one of these things that are listed. So if you want to finish this conversation, that'd be fine.
Okay, Alice Kottmeyer?
Yeah, I just had a comment. I'm from state. I've never heard the term citizen jury, and frankly, I'm not sure what the difference is between that and a federal advisory committee, because it sounds like, I mean, you may be using it in an academic context, but the if there are a group of non-federal employees that are together to provide advice and recommendations to a federal agency, it sounds like an advisory committee. So I'm not sure what the term means in the federal context. Over.
I'm putting an EPA link on them in the chat there.
Folks want to peruse that. Peter Strauss?
I think citizen juries is mildly confusing, given that focus groups and advisory committees are already there and people understand them as formally differentiated. Whether you can have a citizen jury without it being an advisory committee, or whether one couldn't equally describe a focus group as a citizen jury, I see no particular reason to list it.
I obviously defer to the committee on that.
Hey, Connor, we do have an expert on the phone at the meeting on citizen juries, namely Reeve, who wrote an article on the subject in the Administrative Law Review. I don't want to put him on the spot, but if he had
I wasn't going to call him out there.
Yeah, but if he has comments, this would be a good time.
Sure. Thank you for that. I'd forgotten that. So Reeve, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm more than happy to weigh in. And I had actually, even though I did write an article on this in the Administrative Law Review, had when I was reviewing the draft with Leanne had suggested deleting it, mostly for the reasons mentioned here. I mean, I think it's a very useful concept, an interesting idea, and something that would be valuable for agencies to try. I don't know that they have really any experience with it as of yet, or if they do, it's relatively minimal. So that would be one reason not to include it. I guess the other reason would be, the ones that we've discussed, that to some extent it's perhaps redundant of things already on the list. And in particular, at least in my article, and any citizen advisory committee that would be created would be structured as an advisory committee subject to the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So unless we sort of want to identify that possibility specifically as sort of a subset or a type of advisory committee, I think that otherwise it would sort of be encompassed within what we already have here. Though I do think, it's obviously a very interesting and potentially valuable concept.
Do any committee members want to speak in favor of including citizen juries? Okay, hearing none, we'll strike that and leave advisory committees. Leanne, we have another comment. We can hear comments on all of two, and Charlie will go back to you on one. But what's Leanne, I see a note at line 73 to 74. Let's just address that.
I think there was a question about what the sentence in soliciting feedback through these possible methods, agencies should be cognizant of the ability of individuals to provide input means. And I think I've put the comment from the FCC in the wrong place, which I believe was on this point.
Is that on 3? I'm losing track of the.
No, I think that the FCC's comment was on the last sentence.
So it's kind of
Right.
echoing that.
Yes.
Got
And they
it.
had
Jen,
some
did you-
proposed
yo,
language.
Got it. Why don't we take a second to read the FCC's? This came in a little bit later, so that's why we didn't circulate it. But why don't we take a minute to read that, and then Jen, if you want, you can speak on this. Jen, if you want to speak, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. I think the language in the draft that was sent out was something that I had suggested. And so in a sense, I was trying to wordsmith myself here. And hopefully this is a little bit clearer.
I think that's a sensible suggestion, but do any of the folks with hands up right now want to speak on this particular comment and point? Sid, Peter, Bill, or Charlie?
Yes.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, we were, this particular sentence really kind of is at the heart of the whole recommendation for our office, for input from small entities. Obviously, we have a statute that provides for that, but what we wanted, I just wanted to point out that there are several issues that are all kind of rolled up in this one sentence in soliciting feedback. And one is the quality of the material, not the quality meaning, you know, good, better, best, but the types of materials and types of data and types of questions that are being asked. Should the agencies decide, should an agency decide to do early outreach? The issues that are outlined in whatever materials are presented are going to kind of determine for a small business, or maybe for an unsophisticated, relatively unsophisticated audience, what kind of feedback, if at all, the agency is going to get. And so, you know, we think that, we actually think that this sentence should be broken out as a separate recommendation, because there's too much packed into it. Because there's quality of materials that will get to the target audience. The agency should have that, a target audience. The presentation should be such that it elicits a response that's going to be useful to the agencies, which means that individuals and maybe bigger entities are going to have, there's going to be a requirement on them to understand those materials. So do they have the kinds of information in there that's going to be available, or it's going to make sort of an informed response easy? I use that word guardedly, but if we make a recommendation to an agency to solicit input, and then don't make a recommendation on the quality of how they do it, they're only going to hear it at best from people that they're already hearing from. So and then the other thing is that in this just the way that I'm looking at this sentence, there's also the question of incentivizing the response. So I think that's sort of implied in this sentence, but it ought to be brought out. So we think that in soliciting feedback, the agency should explain either possible consequences of what they have in mind, or something like that, so that the participants know what the importance providing a response is, and that would sort of overcome, especially for people not, or entities not totally conversant in regulatory speak, would incentivize them to provide some input. So my suggestion would be to break that sentence out into a separate recommendation, because it really doesn't have to do with choosing which type of outreach you use. No, regardless of what type you choose, this sentence would still be true. And as I say, it sort of packs a lot of stuff in there from my understanding.
Do you have suggested language for a new new additional recommendation, separate recommendation?
Yes, actually, I do. If where would you like me to put it?
If you
You
have
can
it,
drop it in the chat to me and I can copy and paste it
as I
in.
say, yeah.
All
that'd be
right, let me
best.
do that.
Perfect.
So
Go ahead.
I'm done. So I'll send this to Leanne.
Good. And Leanne can drop it in. While we're doing that, Chris or Stuart, do you have a reaction to the general point that Charlie's making? Okay, hearing none. Bill Funk.
Well, I was going to speak in favor of the original change that suggested. I thought both the placement was better than originally and the language was better than originally. With respect to Charlie's suggestion, I'm not sure how specific one needs to be. If when we see his language, maybe I guess we're seeing it now, but I'll save any comment on that.
Okay. And when you're done speaking, if you could just take your hand down so I can keep the queue manageable. Peter Strauss.
So I'm impressed by what Charlie said and generally in favor of it. I thought his substitute sentence much better than the last sentence as it previously was, and was going to have some negative things to say about that. Although Charlie's sentence I thought would be improved by, instead of saying such individuals, by saying something like those individuals who are solicited. But the general suggestion is that the whole of this paragraph past H, negotiated rulemaking, really is the meat of what I understood Charlie to be speaking to, and should form part of the new recommendation if there's to be a new subset of the recommendation, because considering whether the methods will engage a wide range of interested parties, including those who are typically underrepresented, is very much a part of that issue. And I suppose transparency is as well.
Do we all want to just take a second and read the language that Charlie sent over, and then we can discuss, react to it?
It's off the screen again.
Yeah, just give a second. Okay, let's just read lines 75 through 83, and then I'll open discussion just to those lines, and I'll reopen the chat and reopen the hand raising function.
And I'm sorry, I had a question. Charlie, you sent this to me as 3 separate paragraphs. Did you want this to be 3 separate recommendations, or just that those were the 3 components you wanted included in one recommendation?
3 components in one recommendation. And, without the numbers or ABC doesn't really matter to me. It looks kind of dense now that I see it that way, but it really doesn't matter.
So Connor?
Yes, we want to talk about such individuals at line 76.
Well, no, I'm going to start by saying, why not start this paragraph with agency should consider whether not these methods, whether their methods will engage a wide range of interested parties. And then not such individual. No, that should be the first sentence, not the last, not the second. And then agencies should consider whether their methods will engage a wide range of, when determining which methods to use, agencies should select methods that facilitate input from those they are soliciting.
Sorry, can you repeat the second half of that sentence? Agencies should select methods that.
Facilitate input from those they are soliciting.
Do we want to see something like effectively facilitate input? Or something?
Good, that's fine. And I would add that Leah's left out the phrase which is in two, including individuals and groups who are affected by the rules and traditionally underrepresented. I think including the idea of underrepresentation, of going after those who are underrepresented, is a good thing to do.
So sorry, Peter,
So
are you suggesting just moving this
in
whole
3,
sentence?
agencies should consider whether their methods will engage a wide range of interested parties, comma, including individuals and groups who are affected by the rule and traditionally underrepresented. Yeah, good.
And then do we want the transparency point, which is to just remain in what would be recommendation 2?
Either place.
Either place.
It should remain not on wherever the Committee on Style thinks it makes most sense.
Bill Funk.
The new 3 that we've come up with sounds like you're talking about the actual notice for proposed rulemaking and the rulemaking process, but this is that. This is all early alternatives in the rulemaking, and the phraseology all about not experience in the rulemaking process. This all just seems like something that's more appropriate for the rulemaking itself rather than for trying to figure out alternatives early in the process before the rulemaking.
But this is the rulemaking, in effect.
I don't think so. This is all about finding alternatives early on before you do the rulemaking.
It's all about engaging people before the notice of proposed rulemaking.
Correct, before the notice.
Right.
At line 84, would it help to say possible consequences of the potential rulemaking or
Yes.
something along those lines? Possible rulemaking. What are reactions to Bill Funk or reactions from anybody just on how recommendation 3 reads as drafted now?
I tend to agree with Bill's point. It sounds perhaps more prescriptive than we might have intended, given that this would be an early stage of the agency's process. And I'm wondering if there's some way to soften the language slightly, perhaps something along the lines of, when determining which methods might be most effective, agency should consider blah, 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 blah.
Sorry, were you talking about there? Did I put that in the right place?
Right. And then maybe, something like agencies should consider, or sorry, I'm not getting the right words here, but, consider, for example, okay, so actually, let me see. Consider which methods would most effectively facilitate input from those they are soliciting.
That's quite redundant.
Yes, I know.
Take off the second effectively.
agencies should consider which methods would facilitate input from those they are soliciting, comma, for example. What I'm really trying to get at here is that the remainder of these are things that agencies should be thinking about, but not to suggest that this is not to suggest that agencies need to jump through each of these hoops before they solicit early input if they're not appropriate.
At line 81, what do folks think about a qualifier along the lines of agencies should endeavor to make participation? As I understand your point, Jen, this is all optional outreach. So we do want to emphasize the points that the SBA folks that Charlie's making, but we also don't want to make this sound like, why would I want to even do this at all if I don't have to? So there's sort of a little bit of a tension there. But I don't know what folks think about that. Sid?
Back in the second sentence, you could connect the second and third sentences to make it a little less prescriptive. Facilitate input from those they are soliciting, such as providing materials.
I like that. I don't know. Charlie, what are your reactions? I see your hand up.
Well, some of it sounds a little bit like we're commenting on our own recommendation. I think it's all good. I mean, this discussion is very good. I don't know that the agencies need all that, given that we've already recommended that they do something that looks like something out of the list that was in recommendation 2. So it just seems like a lot of, it sounds more like commentary to me, but they're going to do this. The agencies are going to do this, and it's nice to make a recommendation. Or it's nice to feel like we're making a recommendation that we know the agencies are going to follow. And for me, the main thing is that when they do this, assuming this recommendation, new 3, assumes that the agencies have decided or are close to deciding to do something like early outreach. The important thing is when they do that, they provide materials and everything that will overcome what we run into all the time, and that is an audience that doesn't know why they should. And so we do a lot of instruction on why, say, a small business might want to write a comment letter, or why they might want to participate in a Sabrifa panel, or why they might want to engage an agency early on. We just have a lot of experience on it. We know that there is some reluctance, there's a lack of expertise, and most important, there's a lack of time to dedicate to the rulemaking process, which is where that particular phrase came from. But I'm okay with all of this. It doesn't detract from what, from my point of view, is the main point of new 3, and that is the agency should do specific things when they do this early outreach to make sure that it's effective.
Other comments on how new 3 reads as drafted?
It might help respond to Bill Funk's concern by introducing at the very beginning of 3 words like to facilitate their early outreach.
I like that. That kind of connects to the main thrust of the recommendation. It makes the recommendation new 3 read on its own a little bit better too. Additional comments? So, Leanne, do we have anything left on recommendation 2 that we did not discuss, or does this resolve the pre-submitted comments?
I think that resolves everything that was pre-submitted.
I want to go back to 2 then and see if anyone else had any comments about 2 as it reads now. Sid, was that a hand? Yes.
Thanks. I apologize. I missed the last meeting, and this may have been all hashed out. And I apologize again because I have to leave this meeting to teach. Same reason I missed the last one. But I was wondering why negotiated rulemaking is in 2. This is a Bill Funk-like objection. It doesn't strike me as a preliminary methodology for soliciting various alternatives, since the end of negotiated rulemaking is a proposed rule.
I don't recall that we went into great depth on this question, actually. Does anyone want to speak to this? Stuart or Chris?
I don't have any strong feelings one way or the other. I will note that when we were talking to agency officials, it occurred naturally to them that negotiated rulemaking was one of the techniques they used to solicit alternatives early in the rulemaking process. But I don't feel strongly one way or the other whether it should be in there.
Connor, I'd say that in as much as any negotiated rulemaking would have to involve advisory committees includes negotiated rulemaking. It's broader, but would include it.
Does anybody on the committee wish to speak in favor of retaining negotiated rulemaking? I take your point that sort of, if you look at the definition in the law of negotiated rulemaking, it does seem out of scope. But does anyone want to speak in favor of including it?
I would leave it in, and I would leave it in because it's the one element, well, in addition to the AP, the advance notice, I suppose, of the APA that specifically looks to pre-NPRM development of a proposal. And it's kind of strange for it not to be out, given what this is all about. It could be put in as a, advisory committees, including the use of negotiated rulemaking, if that were thought important. But
This is sort of a hybrid in the sense that it's pre-NPRM, but certainly intended to develop an NPRM. What do folks think about Peter's suggestion?
I think it's fine if agencies consider this to be a useful methodology for developing a range of alternatives. So maybe it does fit. I just wanted to raise the question because it did seem a little out of sync.
And I would just echo what Stuart said, that, in more than one interview, I believe that this idea of negotiated rulemaking came up as something that agencies look to gather input. So if we're trying to look for possible ways of engaging agencies and recognizing the ways they like to use, it probably makes sense to leave it in, or potentially.
Any objections to how line 65 is drafted now? Other comments on, I see somebody with a hand up. Alice Kuttmeyer?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on this because this seems to be at least phrased as kind of an exclusive list. It doesn't say, include but not limited to. So possibly negotiated rulemaking should stay in for that reason. But I'm not hard over on it one way or the other.
Any other comments on recommendation 2 as drafted? Alice, did you want to include a clause at line 59 following methods of soliciting to make clear it's not an exclusive list? Or
I actually, I like the professor, I also missed the last meeting. So I'm not sure what discussion was made about that. So I don't want to jump in the middle of that. I just was just pointing out, it seems to be, these are the things you should consider when you're considering this. So if that's what we mean, then that's fine. If we really mean they should go outside this list and think outside the box and look at other things, and maybe we should put some qualifiers in there about include but not limited to, or something like that. But it depends on what the committee discussed at the last meeting. Again, I'm not hard over on it. I don't want to jump in the middle of something that was already discussed.
I don't remember recalling that. So the idea would be the methods of soliciting input, including the following methods. I don't know what folks Chris and Stuart or others have a reaction to, so then get rid of the first following.
I would say, just again, kind of thinking about agencies and what they do. I think including the following, I think broadening it is nice, just in the sense that this was not an exclusive list, at least that they relayed to us that they do use, and some may call, focus group something else. They may have periodic calls, for example, and that sort of thing where they engage parties. So just kind of broadening it might be a good idea from that perspective.
In the sense that agencies use little different methods and so much heterogeneity out there. Other reactions? Okay, hearing none, then let's go back up to recommendation 1. I think Charlie had something quick on recommendation 1.
It's more of a question, and it's letter I, the timing of the rule, including deadlines. The question I have is the delay. The delay could be referring to the delay of considering alternatives at all, or it could be the delay due to alternatives that get raised at this stage. Yeah, again, assuming that the agencies are going to do early outreach. So it's ambivalent or something of it that I think ought to be clarified, but it may be just a language thing. It's just a question. So in the report essentially said most agencies are considering alternatives in the early going. It just doesn't get into the record, or they don't talk about it too much, or so if they're already doing it, and these recommendations are to facilitate better outreach and better use of early input, then the delay that this particular recommendation should be referring to is the delay due to considering new alternatives that they hadn't already been considering, right? And so my question is, if that's correct, then maybe I could submit a language change later on.
Yeah, I think my recollection, others should speak up, is the idea was just the idea that engaging in early outreach takes time. It's just a broader point, and there's a cost to that. And so we may actually want to be less specific and just say, including deadlines, any harms that might occur from delay, and end it there. But that's just my initial take. I see Peter Strauss has a hand up.
Well, I wonder about the initial phrase. It seems to me that what we're talking about, the factors that the agency should consider, is not the timing of the rule, because we don't yet know whether there's going to be a rule proposed. But any deadlines, just start with any deadlines the agency may face, and any harms that may result from the delay required to consider alternatives.
Well,
or that might result from delay.
I'm thinking that if there's no time to consider any alternatives when most agencies under ordinary circumstances would be, then agencies have other means to deal with that, for example, direct finals and that kind of stuff. I think that the kinds of timing issues that I thought this was referring to would be, say, a statutory deadline. It's an act of Congress says you have to deliver a rule by such and such a date. And so a robust consideration of alternatives is just not available. That might be one scenario. So, but my question is whether we're talking about all consideration of alternatives in this, or just the consideration of alternatives that may be generated by early input. So that's why they wouldn't engage in on a particular rule. They don't want to do early input because they just don't have time to consider any additional alternatives to the ones that they've already considered. It's a small point. I just wanted to actually just ask the the writers, whether that, first of all, that question makes sense, or whether it's important to make that distinction. I don't, I think it's just a concern that I think ought to be clarified, but it's not an important concern. So if we want to move on, we can.
I don't know what Leanne or Chris or Stuart think. My sense was the idea was any harm from delay, and not from considering alternatives at all, but from the type of consideration this recommendation is sort of outlining. And
that's what I thought. That's what I thought too.
Connor, could I suggest? Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think I agree with Connor and Charles, and I like Peter's revised language there. I think that kind of captures the spirit of where we were.
Okay.
Somebody else was going to say something.
Connor, I was just going to suggest, is it possible that what we want to say is that might occur from the delay required to solicit early input, that it's not the consideration of alternatives delay that we're worried about, but how much time it takes to get people to give feedback, because that's what this recommendation is really about?
Or just required to solicit and consider, solicit and consider early feedback. I don't know what, I think solicit is key, Leanne. I agree with you.
Sure.
But I don't know what do folks think about that.
Yeah, I
Charlie?
think that's a great addition.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear Stuart.
I think that's a good addition. But
If that's what was intended, it certainly clarifies it.
That's how I understood the intention. I guess if you want to be super clear, it'd be like delay required to comply with the spirit of this recommendation or something like that. But
I think we drafted this on the fly during the last committee meeting, so it is perfectly reasonable that we weren't as clear as humanly possible.
Peter, did you have additional thought? Peter Strauss?
No.
Okay. If you don't mind just taking your hand down, just so I know.
I've lost the screen for some reason.
Okay.
I'm trying to get it back.
I understand, sorry. Additional thoughts on how lines 51 to 53 are drafted? Hearing none, then let's move down to, was now recommendation 4, which focuses on internal agency process. And I think we've got some, Leanne, do you want to walk us through some of these comments?
Sure.
Or, yeah, go ahead.
I think the question here is, there was a question of whether this is ambiguous. I think this was Reeves' point, so he may be able to speak to this more specifically, but he wasn't sure whether what is now 4 was saying that agencies should create a pilot program and then document in the NPRMs the decision as to which approach works best, or saying that the agency should try different methods in a specific rule and then provide just a discussion of what worked best in that particular rule. And I think Chris had a follow-on comment here where he said it seemed to suggest testing various methods for soliciting input should apply to regulatory alternatives an agency is considering. However, I think the committee suggested that the solicitation of public input should also apply to generating alternatives as well. So I think there's some ambiguity in this one.
Reeve and Chris, you guys should speak to your thoughts about what this should look like, and you guys can decide which order.
Yeah, so I think Leanne has well articulated sort of what my concern was. I think either approach, sort of a pilot program that would be then implemented more broadly, or testing within an individual regulation, and then, indicating the results of that test would be fine. I think either one is legitimate. It was just ambiguous to me the way it was currently written, whether either of those things was intended or both were intended. So my only suggestion would just be sort of clarification as to intent. But I think conceptually, either or both of those would be perfectly legitimate. It's really just sort of a question of language.
I sort of understood number 2 is where the committee was, but I'm not sure if others agree with that. But Chris, what was your thought?
Yeah, I just was thinking, I thought the spirit of what this recommendation was about, both considering or getting input on alternatives that are being considered as well as generating alternatives. So, but maybe I was wrong in that, but that's, so consider testing different methods to generate alternatives, or to add something, a phrase in there like that.
Reeve, what's your sense of that revision?
Take it off mute. Let me take a quick look at that, everyone.
Others should take good thoughts.
Okay. Consider testing different methods to generate alternatives. Yeah, I think that that's certainly helpful in terms of clarifying sort of what's intended in the first sentence. But I guess sort of my question would still remain as to, are we talking about sort of for all time, essentially, testing different alternatives in the initial instance and then deciding, okay, these are the best approaches and this is what we'll, use going forward, and memorializing that on an ongoing basis? Or are we talking about more testing within the context of an individual rule? You try 5 different approaches and decide that, 1 and 2 work particularly well, and then 3 through 5 don't. And then you indicate in that specific rule, that this is the result of our testing. It's really more sort of, is it across the board, to apply to all rules based on the pilot programs, or at least a subset of rules? Or is this determination to be made on an individual rule by rule basis in every instance? And again, I take no position on that. My question is really more one for the committee, just in terms of clarification of intent.
Reeve, am I correct that the ambiguity then is in the phrase describe the outcomes? In that second sentence?
Well, describe the outcomes, and then also of using the different methods in the inference for the rules in which they are used. I mean, I guess the question is the agency setting sort of an across the board array of alternatives, and then, let's say they have A through E, and then in any individual rule, you say we used A and C, but not B, D, or E? Or is it more that the agency is testing in the context of a specific rule, which I'm not really sure, I guess, how that would work in practice. So maybe what is intended is the agency has more of an across-the-board approach that they test, then they try different alternatives within the context of specific rules. I guess that's fine. Then I guess my question would be, do we want to then also ask the agency to memorialize in some fashion the array of potential alternatives that they consider in the context of any rule, and announce that more broadly?
Starting, Chris, from your research, do you have a reaction on the appropriate scope here?
I kind of thought this recommendation was, maybe I'm misunderstanding what Reeve's saying, but I thought this recommendation was more about the methods, the approaches. So one of the things that came out of our discussions and our research was the variety of different methods that agencies use to solicit input on alternatives or to generate alternatives. Different, and they had specific ways that they like to approach it. And we thought that there would be some good opportunities for learning across agencies as a result of this. They had a kind of a preferred style. Perhaps it was historical, something they started using and just continued to use. And so, our thought was that, some generation of ideas around approaches to solicit alternatives might allow agencies to kind of broaden their methods and perhaps do a better job of it.
Sorry to disrupt the discussion, but Peter Strauss has sent a note that he needs to jump off in about 20 minutes. And he had submitted a lot of helpful comments on the preamble. So I'm sorry to move around, but I think what we'll do is we'll come back to this. People should mold this. Let's just jump up to the preamble and work through as much preamble as we can while we work through Peter's, the section is kind of edited by Peter while he's here, while we have his time, and then we'll jump back to number 4. So I'm just going to open up the first paragraph of the preamble to discussion, and Chris can speak to his comment, and then we can work through paragraph 1 with Leanne's comment.
Yeah, so I was just, I guess I was just noting the word publication. Maybe it was just in how I was reading it, but it was almost suggesting that publication of regulatory alternatives was going to occur before the notice. And so I guess that I'm not sure that's what the intent of that sentence was.
Well, it is, and it is because this recommendation, at least as I understand it, is quite integrated with things like ANPRMs and development of the regulatory plan and other quite public elements of the development of a rulemaking procedure.
Did you, Peter, do you have an idea of that meaning something beyond like outreach and publicity? Do you publication meaning something beyond the idea of engagement and outreach?
No. Development and outreach concerning, that's fine.
Does that help, Chris?
Yeah, so I think it was just about the publication. It was almost giving me the sense that the suggestion was they should publish this, perhaps in the Federal Register or something before issuing the notice.
No. Development and outreach concerning regulatory, no of there.
Additional comments. Leanne, did you want to speak to your concern over reorganization and streamlining, or if there's somebody else, I guess I can speak to that.
This wasn't specific to me. I think just in the review process, because we were integrating a number of people's comments together in both the agency's prior language and Peter's excellent comments, we weren't sure if we were going to want to wordsmith this together a little bit more to make sure it was coherent as an introductory paragraph.
I'll just take a moment and everybody can just kind of skim through it. Any reactions on paragraph 1 are welcome. Okay, well, we have Peter. Let's move on then to paragraph 2, looking at ACUS history. Jen, did you want to speak to your comment at line 25?
Sure. No, this is just a word choice question. I wasn't sure the word contents fit there, so suggested a couple of alternative formulations.
I like describe this early outreach.
The alternative suggestion and their early outreach efforts. And leave out the word describe. Because discuss is all takes care of that.
Reactions on these edits. Any reactions on lines 13 through 28? Okay, hearing none, let's move on to the third paragraph. lines 29 through 37.
One possible addition, which would accommodate what we've just been talking about before you took us here, Connor, which I do appreciate. In lines 33 and 34, agencies will need to consider whether the benefits of early outreach outweigh the costs, including the resources required to conduct the outreach, or any delays entailed.
And that ties it to the part of the corresponding portion of the recommendation itself.
Right, exactly.
Reactions on that addition. Are there any reactions on lines 29 to 37, the final paragraph of the preamble? Okay, hearing none, then let's go back to recommendation 4 where we were discussing. And
Thank you, Connor.
you're welcome. Thanks for the comments. And thank you to everybody who submitted comments. Reeve and Chris, I mean, I don't think we have any conceptual hang up here. I just think we want to just be clear about where we are. So do you all have additional, Reeve or Chris, or others have additional suggestions for changing or editing the language on lines 88 through 92?
I guess my only, so I definitely agree with everything Chris says, and I think that sounds like a conceptually valuable thing to include. There is certainly some benefit in the experimentation. I guess my only question would be, as I'm looking at it now, so I agree with what the first sentence says. There's value to testing these different approaches. I really agree with what the second sentence says too. As appropriate, agencies describe the outcomes of using these different methods and the MPRMs for the rules in which they're used. I guess my only question then for the group would be, in addition to that, if the agency finds that particular types of approaches work especially well, would they want to announce that more generally, not just in the specific rules for which they're used, but sort of, this could be part of a rule in rulemakings, or it could be part of some guidance document or something on their website or whatever. Do they want to memorialize in some fashion these particular types of approaches work well and these other approaches don't work as well, or they work well in these particular types of rules, and then they would further in those individual instances in which they are used indicate in the NPRM, we use methods A, B, and C for the following reasons. I guess that's the only question I have, growing out of sort of what I perceived as the ambiguity in the original version. But I think if we were to add something like that, or if we weren't to add something like that, I think it would be fine either way. But I think there might be some value in agencies sort of memorializing what works well and what doesn't work well more generally, rather than simply on a rule by rule basis. So I guess I just put that out there for the committee's consideration if there's some value in including something like that.
Chris and Stuart, did you encounter this in your research? And I don't remember, is there anything on this point in the report?
I don't think I don't think agencies are doing a lot of this right now. Like I suggested, I think, and Stuart may have a different impression. My sense is that they have a particular style that they use and it works for them, but they don't necessarily, in some cases they may, but don't necessarily expand beyond that. And so the only goal here was simply to get them potentially to explore a bit more. But I don't think generally that they're in some ways documenting this sort of thing or really engaging much in experimentation right now.
Well, to some degree, I think what we were trying to get at that a little bit with the last recommendation. Now that's more on an interagency basis than an intra-agency basis, but the idea of agencies talking about what works generally and what doesn't work generally and getting a better idea across the government of doing that is something I think we aspire to and tried to capture in the last, in the material that led to the last recommendation there.
Does anybody on the committee wish to speak in favor of adding a sentence along the lines of what Reeve was outlining, the idea? Okay, hearing none, additional suggestions on the language for 4 on clarifying, lines 88 through 92 on clarifying or making this stronger? Okay, and moving to recommendation 5, which is the internal process. And is this where Kevin, is this where Kevin's?
Oh, I'm sorry. Kevin's comment is on what's now number 4. It's just separated from the previous one. His proposed sentence would go in between what is currently the first and second sentence.
Kevin, if you're on, do you wish to be recognized to speak on this comment?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine.
Okay. And thanks for entertaining this comment. So based on some very wise counsel I got, including a senior distinguished member of ACUS, my original proposal was too far, suggesting one approach, just based on some brief experience. And the DOE process rule came to my attention too. So these are both two really excellent procedures that have been adopted for the last 20 years by DOE and EPA respectively. And, you know, I've seen very positive comments about both of these. So I suggested some very, very timid language that said, okay, since this draft says we're going to give people some advice about, you know, how to do early input, I suggested then maybe we should give them some examples of early input that we have some experience with. So they have to be potentially adapted to the agency's statute and what their needs are, but these, you know, work quite well for these two agencies. So I thought this was a good opportunity to make that knowledge available. It's basically sharing, like we were talking about at the bottom of 4 now, sharing their good experience with others. I'm willing to take questions too, but I'm hoping there are people who are familiar with both SBREFA and the process rule who are on this call. Thanks for that opportunity.
Stuart and Chris, I'd be curious for your reaction. My reaction is that this comment conceptually fits more with respect to our recommendation that outlines the types of pre-NPRM research, but I'd be curious for your, it's not so much in recommendation 4, but I guess in recommendation 2, it's recommendation 2, but I'd be curious for your reactions.
Well, certainly we, you know, it's into the process role actually did come up, and I guess one worry about referencing it in particular is we're not sure of what its fate will be in the months and years ahead. The SBREFA process obviously more well established. I leave it really, I mean, I think what we found is that in the case of the one agency subject to SBREFA that we looked at, and certainly that I've looked at my own research, there were definite benefits to the process there, but I leave it to the committee in terms of whether or not to memorialize that in the recommendation.
Connor, could I just offer a point of clarification on the process rule?
Yeah.
I did look at that and the process rule changes, and I was concerned about whether they would live on in the proposal that people have seen from April 12th. And not to my surprise, the proposed changes do not affect the early input portion of the process rule that's been working well for 20 years. And DOE is making changes to, well, other elements of the rule, including potential substantive standards, but the substantive standards don't apply to other agencies. So my concern is that it really will, it should work fine.
One possibility would be with respect to the Sabrifa panels to include them in the preamble where we cite the Reg Flex Act. I don't know, Charlie, what would be your reaction? So this would be where, I think currently footnote 3, what would your thoughts be about including the Sabrifa panels in footnote 3?
Well, I do think that if agencies have the resources to do anything like a Sabrifa panel, that it is the best example of what agencies do right now. I'm certainly a little biased on that opinion, but it has proven results. I'm kind of with Kevin putting it where it is. I think in a footnote, it doesn't quite have the same force. I would like this committee to recommend that agencies consider among the choices that they have, that kind of an outreach strategy, and the process rule also as somewhat similar and less resource intensive. I guess I'm saying I would not like to see it put in a footnote. I'd be happy to see it in the place where Kevin is suggesting, or some other place, perhaps in the list. But it might require some editing.
Oh, fuck.
If we put those two as examples in that list, they're not as universal as these kinds of items are. It would be what I think Kevin's request or his edit is trying to do is to say some agencies already have regular or routine ways of soliciting early public input. And so that's sort of an acknowledgement, and not just an acknowledgement, but put that in front of the agencies as we are making these recommendations. Seems like a good idea. I don't know how else to say it, and I don't know where else to say it. But I don't think it would be. I don't think it would be a really good idea to put it in a footnote, because that would say, by the way, if it would be a by the way kind of recommendation, rather than saying you should consider this if you can.
Go Funk.
I was a little concerned about the specific references to particular statutes and particular regulations, especially regulations that might change, even if they aren't presently being changed. And I wondered whether or not it could be said more generally. I mean, I think that kind of language would be perfect in the preamble, where we do cite statutes and regulations more likely, and I think it should go in the text rather than footnote. There's a place where you could say agencies should consider what other agencies have done or are doing, for example, and then have that. And I think if we want to keep it in a recommendation as opposed to the preamble, I mean, I would think that agencies should consider the approaches that have been successfully used by other agencies, period.
Other reactions from committee members on the general direction? I guess the alternatives would be to add something to the preamble, or to do nothing, add something to the preamble, or potentially to add something in the recommendation. Does anyone want to speak in favor of any of these approaches? Charlie?
Well, I guess I'm inclined to think that what Bill just said would accomplish what I think we want to accomplish if we reference these two specific examples in the preamble, and then in the appropriate recommendation include the experience of other agencies that would be kind of an explicit reference to what we said in the preamble. That would accomplish what I think we're trying to accomplish here. That's really my reaction.
So the idea would be something to the effect of agencies should consider approaches that are being used by other agents, maybe take out successful to being used by other agencies. And then examples include, I don't know, what do folks, go ahead.
Do we have a proposed location, or should I just keep this in the comment bubble for now and then we'll worry about location after?
Let's see what folks think about the general idea of adding something along these lines to the preamble. Favor or against? Any thoughts about the idea of adding this idea to the preamble? What do folks think about putting the idea that approaches that are being used by other agencies, including pursuant to statutes and rules? The idea being that there is law out there requiring some of this sort of activity. So let's look at what's being done out there pursuant to the law. Charlie?
So I'd be okay with that as long as, the specific reference to the panels and the process rule were in the preamble.
For example, agencies have engaged in early outreach pursuant to SBREFA panels.
Well,
rules such as.
It's this, Connor, I think it's, if we have the two things, if SBREFA and the process rule are mentioned specifically in the preamble, which is not very long, so it would be prominent regardless of where it shows up there, then if we reference in this section here, the successful uses of or successful methods, or I do like the idea of including successful in when we reference agencies' experiences and certain agencies' experiences. Then I'm happy. It's just an editing question.
Yeah, I don't know. Stuart and Chris, do you think we have the basis to make a judgment on the success of the outreach pursuant to these, the DOE rule and the SBREFA panels?
I can't speak to the DOE rule. I mean, the SBREFA panels, we talk about in our report, we talk about the positive aspects of them and also the fact that obviously it's just one constituency, but there could be a model for outreach to other groups. So that one I think has much more in our report than the DOE process rule.
Connor, could I interject? This is Kevin.
Very quickly, I want to keep it
Understood.
with the committee folks.
So on the process rule, so I like the solution I'm seeing, and there's no point including these in the preamble unless you say successful, because why is it there? So on the process rule, you can rely on the discussion in the process rule, in the final process rule, and the proposed changes, where all the entities affected by this on both sides have been in favor of the early input processes as favored by DOE. So I think, if I were the committee, and I would task the consultants to look at the published information in the Federal Register to see if they can recommend back saying, this looks good enough to us. To advise the committee. It's a good solution.
Let's go up to the preamble and see if we can find a space where this sentence might go.
Connor, I have a place which is on, I think, line 24, right after footnote 7.
Okay, let's take a look. I like that. I don't know what other folks think. Well, does anybody wish to speak in favor or against the additions in line 24 through 27, the committee members as it reads right now? I'll take that as general agreement. Let's take a quick voice vote on whether or not to insert successful. I guess that's adverb, successful outreach, or maybe adjective. Agencies have engaged in successful early outreach. So at line 26, Leanne, you can bracket successful. So all committee members in favor of adding successful, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay.
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 All right, the nays have it. And this is something to be taken up again in plenary. Okay. So that point then is, I think, addressed. So let's go back down to the recommendation. Okay, then line, so now we're on recommendation 5, lines 95 through 99. Comments, this is the internal agency process point, yes. Somebody, speak.
Jonathan Doles, yeah, thank you.
Any comments on recommendation 5? Okay, hearing none, recommendation 6. And we had somewhat spirited discussion about whether or not to include consider at line 99. And the idea here is, do we want to add the qualifier? So does anyone wish to briefly speak on the qualifier? And if not, we can take a vote on that issue.
Connor, I
Yes.
would note that in that same recommendation, the second sentence, it has should consider in it. And so it would seem to me you'd probably want to be consistent between the two sentences, whichever way you want to go.
Yeah, I hear that. There are somewhat different points, and so we may wish to make the point in the first sentence stronger than the second. We also I do take your point that we have consider at line 100 as well as in line 99, which is a little bit inelegant. Additional comments on whether or not we want to qualify the first sentence of recommendation 6. Okay, hearing none, we'll take a voice vote. All in favor of the first formulation, which is consider providing, say yay.
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 Yay. All in favor of the second. So just vote the second formulation, which is just the provide, say yay. Okay, then it's consider providing. Any additional comments on recommendation 6? Okay, hearing none, I'll go on to recommendation 7. And here's the idea about discussion of alternatives that were precluded by statute. And we had some discussion again about whether or not to include a qualifier on whether or not the agency should include these. Discussion of legal limits on the agency. Does anyone want to speak on the qualifier issue? Okay, hearing none, all in favor of the first formulation, which is consider including, say yay. Yay.
Yay.
All in favor of the second formulation, which is just include, or I guess it'd be including, say yay. Okay, so the first formulation prevails. Additional comments on recommendation 7 as drafted. Okay, hearing none. Recommendation 8, for those who weren't at the last meeting, we did have a fair amount of discussion about what to recommend here. We discussed various ways to formulate this. We've kind of settled on something more general, directed to the agencies themselves. I don't know if Reeve, Matt, or Leanne want to speak on this recommendation and the drafting of it, but that's my sense of where we were in the last meeting. To be general, the idea of the committee kind of decided to not be too prescriptive about how this would, what forum this would happen in, what process. But I opened this up to comments and discussion on recommendation 8. Okay, hearing none. Any additional comments on the recommendation as we stand now? Thoughts from committee members or ACUS members? Okay, I would move to vote on the recommendation. All in favor of the recommendation, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Should probably be consistent between yay and aye. All opposed, say nay. Okay, thank you very much for your engagement and for sharing so many written comments and helpful discussion. I don't know if Matt or Reeve or Leanne have any closing comments, but I appreciate the committee's hard work.
Just to thank everyone for participating, and especially those who submitted written comments, and in particular among ACUS members, Peter Strauss. And to thank you, Connor and Leanne, of course.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. And we'll look forward to when we discuss this at the plenary session. Hope everybody can join. All right.